campus. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Janice Asare.
So have y'all ever believed in something so strongly and wholeheartedly only to one day find out that your belief was wrong? That is what happened to me. I used to believe that empathy would be what would eradicate racism. I no longer believe that, and I'm here today to talk to you about why. So as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and an anti-racism educator, I've written almost 400 articles on workplace equity, one of which was this article where just a few years ago I said that empathy was the key to a diverse and inclusive workplace. When I talk about empathy, I'm referring to this particular definition from Catalyst, which says that empathy is the skill of connecting with others to identify and understand their thoughts, perspectives, and emotions, and demonstrating that understanding with intention, care, and concern. So often when we think about empathy, we think about this question: how do we get ourselves to put ourselves in the shoes of other people? And oftentimes in the equity space, I hear people saying, if only white people could put themselves in the shoes of black people, then things could really change. But is that true? I'm here today to offer an alternative theory for why empathy will not eliminate racism. Once upon a time, I was sipping the empathy Kool-Aid. Right? I believed that empathy was truly the North Star and what would help to transform the world and truly eradicate racism. And my thoughts about empathy shifted upon the racial revolution of 2020. So the racial revolution is a time right after the murder of George Floyd, when many of us, myself included, were picking up books on anti-racism. We were reading how to be an anti-racist. And it was upon my research and the reading that I was doing that I started to learn more about empathy. I remember when I saw this headline from 2021 that said empathy was the most important leadership skill according to researchers. And it was around this time that I started to learn more about the biased nature of empathy, right? And so empathy is actually flawed. When I started working on my forthcoming book, I started to do a lot of research on racism and what it would really take to eradicate racism. And a lot of the work that I read was research on empathy. And it was upon my research that I discovered that empathy actually has some darker sides, right? And so the darker sides of empathy were actually explored in a book by psychologist Paul Bloom, who wrote this book, Against Empathy, where he talks about these darker sides of empathy. And I was intrigued, right? So I said, darker sides of empathy, right? How could this be? And so one of the things that Paul Bloom talks about in his book is the spotlight effect of empathy, right? So researchers have found that when we're busy feeling empathy for one person or thing, it is very difficult for us to also feel empathy for another person or thing. So our ability to empathize with multiple people at the same time is actually limited. And researchers have also found that our empathy is biased, right? So we are less likely to feel empathy for highly successful people. We are less likely to feel empathy for people who are different from us. And we are less likely to feel empathy for people who we think are responsible for their own misfortune. And we are more likely to feel empathy for people who are similar to us. There is also a racial empathy bias. And researchers have found that people assume that Black people actually feel less pain than other racial groups. And there was one really interesting study that was done where they looked at patient treatment. So they compared white patients and Black patients. And what they found was that Black patients on average are less likely to receive pain medication when they are in pain, and when they do receive pain medication, it is at lower dosages than their white counterparts. So empathy has its limitations, right? Too much empathy is not necessarily a good thing. A doctor or a therapist that has too much empathy will not be able to adequately care for their patients. And a person that has too little empathy or lacks empathy could end up being a psychopath. So empathy has its limitations for sure. So this is a throwback picture of my mom and I. And growing up, my mom and I bumped heads a lot, right? Now we're super close, we're best friends. But both of my parents were super strict, but my mom was really the one that was the stricter one. And I would always try to stay out late as a middle child. I was almost like the black sheep of my family. And I remember my mom and I would always get into it about curfew. And she would get mad I was staying out late. And so one night we were having an argument, and my mom said something to me that I will never forget, right? So she said, "You'll understand one day when you become a parent." And as an adult now, I think back to what my mom said often. And no matter how hard I try to put myself in my mom's shoes, I'll never understand what my mom went through until the day that I become a parent, right? So my ability to empathize with my mom, no matter how hard I try, is actually limited, right? And so thinking back, I now understand 100% why my mom was so strict. And I recognize that part of the reason why my mom was so concerned about me and my well-being was because she knows that if something were to happen to me, my story likely wouldn't get the focus and the attention that it deserves. Why are we more captivated with stories of people like Gabby Petito, Natalie Holloway, and JonBenet Ramsey? So just as a show of hands, I'm very curious, how many of you have heard of JonBenet Ramsey? Okay, so a good amount. So for those of you who are not familiar, JonBenet Ramsey was a 6-year-old beauty pageant queen whose body was found in the basement of her family's Colorado home in the mid-90s. And so for us 90s babies, I remember, all my dad was doing all day, every day was watching news coverage on JonBenet Ramsey. And I remember her story would play over and over and over again on the news. And what's really interesting is when I started to think back about that time, I can't remember any Black, Asian, or Indigenous kids or women or people that went missing, but I vividly remember JonBenet Ramsey, right? So missing white woman syndrome is a classic example of how our empathy is biased. We are more likely to feel empathy for people from certain racial groups compared to others. Another example of how our empathy is biased was seen last year when the conflict between Russia and Ukraine started to intensify. And several members of the media were criticized for how they reported on the conflict. So one news correspondent said, when he was remarking about the conflict, that Ukraine isn't a place like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. He said, "This is a relatively civilized, relatively European city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that is going to happen." And in another news segment, the former Deputy Prosecutor General of Ukraine said that the conflict was particularly emotional for him because it involved, quote unquote, European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. What do the stories of Rodney King, Eric Garner, George Floyd, and Tyre Nichols have in common? All of the brutality and violence that they experienced were caught on film. So Rodney King was a Black man that was caught in a high-speed police chase in the early 90s, and when police caught up with him, they beat him brutally. And his beating was caught on film by an onlooker at the time, and it is largely considered to be one of the first examples of police brutality caught on film. Many of us know the story of Eric Garner, whose only crime was selling loose cigarettes, and he was put in an illegal chokehold by an NYPD officer, and if any of you watched the video, you hear him shouting in the video that he couldn't breathe. We all know the story of George Floyd. Many of us watched it, some of us may not. But we saw George Floyd being kneed in the neck for almost 10 minutes by Officer Derek Chauvin. And just a few months ago, we saw the horrific story of Tyree Nichols, the unarmed black man who was stopped on the same block of his home for a routine traffic stop, and he was brutally beaten. After watching the videos of Eric Garner and George Floyd and Tyree Nichols and Rodney King, shouldn't we all have been able to put ourselves in their shoes enough to push for racial justice? The problem with empathy is that after we put ourselves in people's shoes, the systems and structures that continue to harm Black and racially marginalized people will continue to exist, right? So empathy will not eliminate racism because racism is a systemic issue. So if we really want to eliminate and eradicate racism, we have to think about what structural and systemic solutions will help to eradicate this issue. So we have to think about legislation that supports the most racially marginalized communities. We have to think about programs and policies to repair the harm that racially marginalized communities have experienced. We have to think about reparations for descendants of enslaved people. And we have to think holistically about structural change. So what are some examples of this? What does this look like? Is what you might be thinking. So in education, this could be more transparency around funding. In healthcare, this could be anti-racist curriculum for medical school students and accountability measures for racism in medicine. For housing, this could be more racial diversity for home appraisers, as well as specific programs aimed at helping first-time homebuyers from underrepresented racial groups. And in the workplace, this could look like mentorship and sponsorship programs, as well as specific interventions designed to recruit, retain, and advance employees from underrepresented racial groups. So researchers wanted to look at how do we focus on the systemic issue of Black student academic outcomes, right? Because this is bound to be a systemic issue in many parts of the country. And researchers found that when you engage in specific practices, these specific practices were instrumental in improving Black student academic outcomes, right? So some of these included financial resources for the school districts, Black community members mentoring the Black students, teacher training and supervision, and summer reading programs with free books included. So it is possible to look at a systemic issue and target it with very specific interventions aimed at improving the systems and structures. So if we really want to eradicate racism, we have to think specifically about actions, right? What actions will help us to improve the lives of racially marginalized people? We have to advocate on behalf of racially marginalized people, and we have to think holistically about how we transform our systems. Paul Bloom said in his book, Against Empathy, that we can be motivated to help others without empathy. He said we can understand someone is in pain without actually feeling that pain ourselves. It shouldn't take us needing to feel what another person is feeling or put ourselves in their shoes to push for racial justice, because creating a world where everyone is able to thrive is simply the right thing to do. Systems of oppression are harming each and every one of us. So the faster we are at eliminating these systems of oppression, the better a world we will be able to create for all of us. Thank you.